To fight anti-Semitism, one must be part of a struggle against bigotry in general. For most of my adult life, I would have been a political Zionist, meaning I believe in the idea of a Jewish state, a state that has special obligations to Jews. But I was a liberal political Zionist in the sense that I did not want that state to hold millions of Palestinians who lacked basic rights. So, like many other people, I thought that the answer could be a Jewish state alongside a Palestinian state. I came to the conclusion more recently that that vision is no longer tenable. Israel has made its control over the West Bank permanent, essentially, and that this vision of partition doesn't really reckon with some of the most fundamental issues in the conflict, one of which is the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes, many of which are inside Israel proper, and also the right of Palestinian citizens in Israel, who represent 20% of the population, to be equal. You start to see some significant American Jewish criticism of Israeli behavior, first during the Lebanon War in the early 1980s, and then during the First Intifada in the late 1980s. People saying Israel's really on the wrong path here, but they're certainly not questioning the idea of Israel as a Jewish state. I think what you start to see later is a younger generation of American Jews for whom the notion of Israel as always in existential danger doesn't comport as much with their own experience. Their experiences of seeing Israel as a kind of regional superpower and seeing Israel controlling millions of Palestinians who lack basic rights. And so for this younger generation, I think there's a struggle to kind of try to make sense of the fact that many of them think of being Jewish as being connected to movements for social justice. They're very proud of the American Jewish role in the civil rights movement, for instance, and also think about Judaism as a culture of inquiry and questioning, and yet they feel often that on the question of Israel, these values aren't actually represented. There are many American Jews for whom Zionism is a kind of an essential part of their Jewish identity, and to oppose the idea of a Jewish state for them represents a threat to Jews, period. So there are many American Jews who would take the view that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It's not my view. I think it doesn't actually logically make sense as an argument, and I think it has very negative consequences for the ability of Palestinians to express themselves. If one thinks about the $3.8 billion that the United States gives to Israel, what it really is basically we give Israel a credit card to buy US weaponry. And so it's really a subsidy in many ways to the US weapons industry. And that's part of a much larger story, which is that the US very aggressively goes out and sells weapon systems all around the world. That is a significant, plays a role in American foreign policy. Palestinians in the United States have been significantly excluded from the American debate over Israel-Palestine for a long time. I think that's beginning to change a little bit. You've seen over the past few weeks more Palestinian voices on TV. American Jews have been allowed to have a more prominent voice, and so I am the beneficiary of that, and that creates certain challenges when one enjoys that kind of privilege in the discussion. In mainstream political discourse as represented in Washington, the idea of one equal state which allows Palestinian refugees to return is still very much marginal. Many people are quite comfortable with the one state that we have now, in which millions of Palestinians lack basic rights. But the idea of trying to make it a state with equality for all is a position supported by, I think, only one member of Congress, Rashida Tlaib. But I do suspect that in the years to come, more progressives, including more progressives in Congress, will become open to this idea, if only because they come to see that the notion of partition is no longer viable. Jews, understandably, are frightened of an organization like Hamas. But the argument that I would make is that if you want a society that is peaceful for all people, what you need to do is give people the right to express themselves non-violently. That if you deny people their political rights and they have no voice non-violently, and you use the violence of state oppression upon them, you are actually creating a recipe for more violence. And that ultimately freedom and equality for all people doesn't solve all problems by any means, but it is more likely to create a society that's stable and peaceful for all people.